The perfect morning shatters. The morning began like any other morning inside the towering headquarters of one of the most powerful companies in America. Sunlight streamed through the tall glass walls of the skyscraper, painting streaks of gold. Across the marble floor, the city below moved with its usual rhythm, cars honking, people rushing, business never sleeping, but up here on the top floor there was silence. A heavy silence filled with anticipation and tension. The billionaire CEO sat at the long, polished table, his dark suit perfectly tailored, his tie chosen with precision, his hair combed back with the kind of care only someone obsessed with control could manage. For years he had been known as one of the sharpest minds in technology, the man who built an empire from nothing but an idea his company was worth billions. His name was whispered with respect and sometimes fear in boardrooms across the globe. But today something more important than money was at stake. At exactly 9 o'clock, a group of investors from the Middle East would step into the room, men whose wealth came not from stocks or codes but from the sands and oil fields of their homeland. They had flown halfway across the world to discuss a partnership worth $300 million, a partnership that could expand the CEO's company into new markets, strengthen his global image, and secure his dominance for another decade. He had prepared every detail, every chart, every word of his presentation, and he felt ready, almost invincible. But as the digital clock on the wall showed 8:58, something shifted. A small but fatal crack appeared in his perfect plan. He turned to the chair beside him where the translator should have been sitting. The chair was empty. His stomach tightened. The translator was essential. The investors spoke little English, and though they understood business numbers, they valued culture and respect more in their world. Being understood in their own language was not just polite, it was a sign of honor, a sign of seriousness. Without it, everything could collapse in seconds. The CEO looked toward his assistant, a nervous young man with glasses who always seemed to carry too many papers. "Where is the translator?" the CEO asked sharply, his voice low but edged with steel. The assistant stammered, his face pale. "Sir, she called this morning. Her flight was delayed. She is stuck in another city. She said she might not make it on time." The CEO's chest burned with sudden panic. Not on time, not today of all days. His empire balanced on this meeting. $300 million, his image in the Arab world, his reputation as a flawless strategist. All of it could crumble because one person was not in the room. He clenched, his jaw trying to stay calm. "Find a replacement, anyone," he ordered. The assistant shook his head helplessly. "Sir, we tried. Every translator with the right dialect is already booked." 59. Now, 1 minute left, the CEO pressed his hands flat on the cold table, sweat forming on his forehead. He had faced crises before, but never one so humiliating. He could imagine the headlines already. Billionaire unprepared. Deal falls apart. Empire weakens. His competitors would love it, especially the rival CEO who had been circling like a shark for months, waiting for a single mistake. And now here it was, ready to destroy him. The heavy doors at the end of the room opened. Footsteps echoed. The Arab investors entered, tall men in flowing white robes, their eyes sharp, their expressions serious. They nodded politely, but their silence carried weight. They expected everything to be ready. They expected respect. The CEO stood quickly, forcing a smile, his voice slightly unsteady as he welcomed them in English. They replied in Arabic, long sentences filled with tone and rhythm that he could not understand. His chest tightened further. He glanced to the empty chair of the translator, then back to their faces. He saw impatience already brewing. He began to stutter through his opening lines in English, but their expressions hardened. One of the older investors leaned toward another, whispering something sharp in Arabic. Another sighed loudly, shifting in his seat. The CEO's hands trembled beneath the table, his empire, his pride, his future, all unraveling in front of him. And then, in the corner of the room, by the glass wall stood Isla, the maid. She wore a simple uniform, her hands red from cleaning solution, a bucket and rag at her side. She had been wiping the edges of the room, invisible as always. To her bosses, she was just a shadow, a background, figure who appeared only when dust or fingerprints threatened the perfect shine of the headquarters. But Isla's eyes were different. They were calm, observing everything. She had grown used to being ignored, yet she noticed details others missed. She noticed the sweat on the CEO's forehead, the tight fists of the investors, the silence turning sharp like a blade. And she understood more than anyone else in that room, because the words spoken by the investors were not strange to her. They were familiar. They were her second language. Her heart beat faster. She wanted to look away, to return to scrubbing the windows, but her ears caught every word. The investors were saying, "He is not ready. He does not respect us. This is a waste of time." Isla's throat tightened. She knew these words could destroy the CEO. The man who had never once looked her in the eyes, the man who treated her as invisible. Yet still, she felt something deep inside her. A pull, a whisper telling her this was the moment. This was the choice. The CEO's voice cracked as he tried again to speak, his assistant shifting uselessly. Beside him, the investors exchanged glances, ready to stand up, ready to walk out, ready to take their money elsewhere. Isla tightened her grip on the rag, her lips parted slightly, and before she could stop herself, she whispered in Arabic, soft but clear, "Please wait, he is trying." The words slipped out like a secret, yet they carried across the room. One of the investors froze, his eyes snapping toward the maid. The CEO turned too, stunned, his mind racing. Had his maid just spoken Arabic? The room fell into silence, heavy, electric. Every eye now on Isla, the forgotten figure in the corner. She swallowed hard, her chest rising and falling, the rag trembling in her hand. She had been invisible for so long, but not anymore. Not now. And in that silence, as the investors leaned forward and the CEO stared at her in disbelief, the world shifted. The first crack in the old order had appeared, and nothing would be the same again. Silent eyes in the room. The room seemed frozen in that instant. The CEO's pulse thundered in his ears while the investors sat in silence, their gazes shifting from him to the maid standing in the corner. Isla lowered her eyes quickly, ashamed that her voice had escaped without permission. Her job was to be invisible, not to interrupt high-stakes meetings worth hundreds of millions. Yet her lips had betrayed her, carrying words in Arabic that had already reached the ears of men who were not used to being ignored. One of the younger investors tilted his head slightly, studying her with a spark of curiosity, while the elder among them leaned back with an expression of surprise that softened into thoughtfulness. The CEO's mind scrambled. His empire was built on order and perfection, but right now, disorder reigned. The translator was gone. The investors were losing patience, and now the maid, the woman he had never once spoken to beyond curt nods, had just revealed a skill that could either save or humiliate him. He wanted to dismiss her, to pretend the words had never been spoken, but it was too late. The air was charged. The investors were already whispering quietly among themselves, repeating her words with intrigue, and he knew they were not speaking of numbers anymore, but of her, the maid who had just broken the silence. Isla's heart pounded heavily as memories of her childhood rushed into her mind. Memories she had buried under years of scrubbing floors and polishing glass. She remembered the dusty streets of her small African town where her father had once taught her to read and write. Her father, a teacher himself, believed knowledge was freedom. He insisted that she learn not just her native language but Arabic as well, because he often said, "The world will not open for you unless you can speak its many tongues." She had loved the sound of Arabic, its rhythm, its depth, and its poetry. For years she studied it, and later when her father passed away and her mother struggled to feed her, Hilla carried those words as part of her soul. But life had been cruel, opportunities scarce. She was forced into jobs that had no room for dreams, no space for language, only cleaning supplies and invisible hours. Still, the language never left her. It lived inside her. And now, inside this towering glass building, in a meeting where she had no place, that hidden part of her had slipped out. Her eyes lifted slightly toward the investors, and for the first time in many years, she did not feel like just a maid. She felt like a bridge. Her body trembled, but her mind whispered, "This is why you learned. This is why you survived." The elder investor cleared his throat, turning his gaze directly toward Isla, his voice deep and deliberate as he spoke in Arabic. "Did you just understand us?" His tone carried not anger, but curiosity. Isla's throat dried. She nodded slowly, whispering back in the same tongue. "Yes, sir, I did." Her words were respectful but firm. The room grew heavier. The CEO's eyes widened in disbelief. The investors leaned closer, while the assistant stood frozen, gripping his stack of papers so tightly they nearly tore. The CEO wanted to stop her, to regain control of his collapsing meeting. But his lips would not move. Pride and panic locked him in place. He had spent weeks preparing for this negotiation, yet now the attention had slipped from him entirely. Resting on the maid who had been polishing glass just moments ago, he felt small, exposed, and desperate. The elder investor exchanged a glance with the others, then spoke again in Arabic, his voice sharp this time, testing her. "If you understand us, then tell me, what did I whisper to my brother when your employer began his speech?" His words carried challenge, a test meant to expose weakness. The CEO's stomach dropped. He feared what she might say, feared she would misinterpret or worse, embarrass them. But Isla's answer came without hesitation, her voice steady. "You said he was not ready, and that perhaps you had made a mistake to come here today." A thick silence fell once again. The investors straightened in their seats, their eyes widening. The accuracy was undeniable. She had repeated their words exactly. One of the younger men even smiled faintly, impressed, while another nodded slowly, acknowledging her sharp ear. Isla lowered her gaze again, ashamed that she had revealed their private remark. But there was no turning back. She had spoken the truth, and the truth had power. The CEO could barely breathe. Humiliation burned his chest. They had truly doubted him, and she had exposed it, aloud, but at the same time he realized something. Her words had caught their attention in a way he never could. Her honesty had cut through formality and landed with weight. He saw how the investors looked at her now, no longer as a background figure but as someone who might actually matter. The rival competitor seated quietly at the edge of the table smirked, his eyes gleaming with cruel delight. This was the weakness he had been waiting for. He leaned back, whispering to his associate, "Look at him, his maid is saving him, pathetic." But his smile wavered when he noticed the investors were not mocking. They were intrigued. Their posture relaxed slightly. Their expressions softened, and all of it because of her. Isla felt her knees shake, yet she stood straighter, her hands still trembling from the rag she clutched. The investors began speaking, more rapidly in Arabic, their words sharp and complex, testing her again. She answered each phrase with precision, translating quickly into English for the CEO, her voice clear and unbroken. The CEO stared at her as though seeing her for the first time. The investors leaned forward, nodding, their impatience dissolving into interest, and in that moment Isla realized something powerful. She was no longer invisible. The silent eyes of the room were fixed on her. Her voice mattered. Her presence carried weight, and though fear still rippled through her body, another feeling began to grow, stronger than fear. It was dignity. It was the long-buried pride of a girl who once dreamed of more, a pride that whispered to her heart, "This is your moment, do not let it slip." The maid speaks. The investors sat upright in their chairs, their eyes sharp, their voices layered with rapid Arabic phrases that cut through the air like arrows. They were no longer testing politely. They were probing deeply, searching for weakness, searching for cracks. They wanted to know if the woman who dared to speak their language was truly capable, or if her earlier responses had been nothing more than chance. The CEO felt his stomach twisting as he listened to words he could not understand. He glanced nervously at Isla, praying she would not collapse under the weight of such scrutiny. For in this moment his empire hung not on his years of work, not on the countless contracts he had signed, but on the voice of the maid who had never once been invited to sit at a table like this. Isla steadied herself. She drew in a breath so deep it seemed to press against her ribs, and when she spoke, her voice carried across the entire room, clear, resonant, and unwavering. She translated the investors' words into English for the CEO, not just repeating their sentences but capturing the emotion hidden beneath them. When one investor asked sharply if the company had truly considered the cultural traditions of their market, Isla conveyed it not as a cold question but as a challenge weighted with pride. When another demanded to know why they should trust this foreign corporation at all, Isla delivered it in English with the same edge of suspicion, ensuring the CEO felt the heat of their concerns exactly as it was meant to be felt. The CEO sat stunned, each sentence cut into him, not because of her failure but because of her mastery. She was not softening their words to protect him. She was laying bare their doubts, their anger, their hopes. She was showing him the truth that no translator had ever dared to show. His throat tightened. He had built his empire on numbers and efficiency. But this was something he had never measured. The power of honesty conveyed through language, and the investors were watching closely, their respect for her growing with every word. Yet not everyone in the room was pleased. The rival, competitor leaned back in his chair with a sneer that failed to hide his unease. He had expected the maid to stumble, to humiliate her employer, but instead she was shining, commanding attention with every phrase. He whispered to his associate with irritation, "This is not supposed to happen, she is just a servant." But his words sounded hollow, for even he could not deny that the tide was shifting. Isla's memories flickered again as she spoke, her mind half in the present and half in the dusty classrooms of her childhood. She remembered her father's proud smile when she recited Arabic poetry. She remembered her mother's tired hands scrubbing clothes while murmuring prayers in 2 languages. She remembered how she had promised herself she would never let those lessons die. And here she was, standing in the center of a world she never thought she would enter, holding the attention of men who once would never have looked at her twice. The sensation filled her with both fear and strength, as though destiny itself had placed her here. The elder investor leaned forward now, his expression softer than before. He asked her directly in Arabic why she worked as a maid when clearly she carried the skill of a scholar. His voice was not mocking but sincere, curious, and Isla hesitated before answering. She chose her words carefully, explaining that life had forced her into survival, that dreams had been set aside when tragedy struck her family, that opportunities had been locked away from her, but the language, the knowledge, remained in her heart. She translated her own words into English as she spoke so the CEO could understand, and in that moment the CEO felt a sharp sting in his chest, guilt mixing with awe. He had employed her for months, perhaps years, yet had never once looked beyond her uniform, never once wondered what story lay hidden in her eyes. The room grew warmer. The investors nodded with respect. They understood hardship, they understood dignity, and most of all, they understood courage. Here was a woman who had no title, no wealth, no position of power, yet she had chosen to step forward in a room filled with giants and speak, and they admired it. One of the younger men even smiled broadly, muttering under his breath in Arabic that perhaps destiny had sent them not a translator but a guide. Isla heard it, and though she translated the words, she softened them slightly, not to protect herself but because humility was deeply ingrained in her soul. The CEO sat frozen, his hands resting limply on the table. He was no longer the center of attention, no longer the force that commanded the room. He watched helplessly as the investors directed their questions, not at him, but at Isla, and each time she responded with precision and grace. She was building a bridge he could never have built on his own. His pride battled with relief. Part of him resented that a maid was outshining him, yet another part of him felt an unfamiliar gratitude. She was saving him from disaster, saving his empire, and perhaps even saving him from himself. For nearly half an hour Isla translated tirelessly, her voice unwavering though her body trembled from the weight of responsibility. She caught nuances others would have missed. She explained metaphors. She interpreted tone. She conveyed respect where arrogance might have slipped through. And as the minutes stretched on, the investors began to relax, their arms unfolding, their brows softening, laughter even escaping from one corner of the table. The mood had shifted. The deal that had been slipping into chaos was now stabilizing, and the source of that change was undeniable. It was her. When she finally paused for breath, the room was silent again but no longer tense. It was a silence filled with thought, with reevaluation, with respect. The elder investor leaned back and nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on her. Then he said in deliberate English, "We will continue, but only if she stays at the table." His voice carried finality. It was not a suggestion, it was a condition. The CEO's chest tightened, humiliation mingling with shock. His billion-dollar empire was being negotiated not because of his brilliance but because of a maid he had never seen. He opened his mouth to speak, to protest, but the words died before they could form. He looked at Isla, truly looked at her for the first time, and what he saw was not just a maid but a woman standing taller than her uniform, a woman who had dared to speak when the world expected silence. And he froze, knowing nothing would ever be the same again. Breaking barriers. The room settled into a strange rhythm as the minutes passed, a rhythm the CEO had never experienced in all his years of boardrooms and negotiations. Usually it was him who controlled the flow, him who dictated the tone. But now it was Isla who held the center of gravity. She was no longer simply translating words from one language to another. She was shaping the atmosphere itself. She listened with patience to every Arabic phrase that left the lips of the investors. And when she spoke in English, her voice carried more than meaning. It carried warmth. It carried context. It carried the unspoken values hidden within the language, values that no professional interpreter could have conveyed with such honesty. The investors quickly noticed the difference. They had been to dozens of meetings with Western corporations, where translators reduced their culture to technical phrases where nuance was lost in the pursuit of speed, but with Isla, nothing was lost. When one of them used an Arabic proverb about planting trees under whose shade you may never sit, Isla did not translate it as a simple phrase about patience. She explained it with the depth it deserved, telling the CEO that the investor was not just speaking of business but of legacy, of vision beyond profit. And when she spoke those words, the CEO felt them strike deep, because he realized he had rarely thought of his empire as anything more than numbers and control. The investors began to lean forward more often, their eyes fixed not on the CEO but on the woman at the center of the storm. They began to share small personal details that they would have never risked in a sterile negotiation. One spoke of his father who had taught him to honor every promise. Another spoke of his own son who was studying engineering abroad and how trust meant more than profit. Hila listened with a heart that understood loss and resilience. And when she translated, she gave those stories the weight they deserved, turning what could have been business chatter into human connection. The CEO sat in silence, his pride bruised but his mind awakening. He had never thought of investors as men with stories, as fathers, as sons, as people with emotions hidden behind their stern faces. He had always seen them as numbers, as signatures on contracts. But now he saw them laughing softly at Isla's respectful words, nodding as if she had reminded them that they were more than figures on a balance sheet, and the realization shook him. But not everyone welcomed this shift. The rival competitor, sitting near the edge of the table, grew restless. He had expected this meeting to collapse, had expected to swoop in afterward with a smug grin and offer his own company as the better partner. But now he saw the impossible unfolding. The Maid was building bridges stronger than anything he could tear down. He leaned toward his assistant and hissed in frustration, "This cannot last. They cannot trust a servant more than us." His assistant said nothing, for even he could see the truth. The investor's eyes gleamed with respect every time Isla spoke. The rival finally decided to act. He interrupted with a sneer, speaking loudly in English. "Gentlemen, with all due respect, should your great empire not be represented by professionals rather than by staff?" His eyes flicked toward Isla with cruel disdain, his words dripping with the arrogance of a man who believed hierarchy defined worth. The room chilled. The investors turned slowly toward him, their brows furrowed, and Isla lowered her gaze, shame pressing at her chest. But before silence could choke her, the elder investor spoke firmly in Arabic, his voice carrying authority. "Respect is not measured by titles but by truth." Isla translated his words into English without hesitation, her voice steady despite the storm in her heart. The CEO shifted uncomfortably in his chair. He realized with growing clarity that the investors had chosen their side. They valued sincerity over status, humility over pride, and in this moment, they valued Isla more than him. The rival competitor flushed, his smug mask cracking. He leaned back with a scoff but said no more. Knowing he had miscalculated badly, Isla continued to guide the conversation, and soon the discussion turned to traditions. The investors explained how in their culture hospitality was sacred, how business was not just about contracts but about trust built around a table. Isla added gentle notes, reminding the CEO that offering food, showing patience, and acknowledging family ties mattered more than numbers. The CEO felt his cheeks burn, realizing how blind he had been. He had prepared spreadsheets, graphs, and glossy presentations, but none of it meant anything compared to a simple word spoken with respect. An hour passed, then another, and the atmosphere had transformed completely. The tension that had threatened to collapse the meeting had melted into something warm and human. Laughter occasionally rippled across the table. Investors shared stories not just of oil fields and markets but of childhood, of faith, of journeys, across deserts. And Ela moved between the two languages like a river flowing without end, carrying truth and trust across the divide. By the time the clock struck noon, the investors were no longer looking at their watches or shifting impatiently. They were relaxed, leaning back, sipping the refreshments offered and speaking freely. It was then that one of them, with a smile tugging at his lips, said in Arabic, "We wish to hear her speak, not just translate. What does she believe about this partnership?" Isla's breath caught, her heart hammering. She hesitated, unsure if it was her place. She looked at the CEO, who stared at her, in shock, unsure of whether to forbid or allow. His pride told him to silence her, but the fire in the investor's eyes told him the truth. Without her, the deal was already lost. He gave a faint nod, barely visible, and in that moment the balance of power shifted completely. Isla straightened her shoulders, her hands still trembling but her eyes steady. She began to speak in Arabic, first her words calm and thoughtful. She spoke of dignity, of trust, of how true partnerships were not built on money alone but on respect between cultures. She reminded them that empires rose and fell, but the bonds of honesty and honor endured. Then she turned to English and repeated her own words for the CEO, ensuring that he too heard them, ensuring that he too felt the weight of the values he had long forgotten. The investors listened in silence, nodding slowly, their eyes filled with admiration. The CEO sat frozen, not because of fear this time, but because of something deeper, awe mixed with shame. The maid he had never seen was now the voice holding his empire together. The turning point. The air inside the grand boardroom had changed completely. Only a few hours ago, the space had felt sharp with tension. Every word had been a knife, every silence a threat. But now there was warmth flowing across the polished table, warmth born not of numbers or contracts but of human connection. Ela sat no longer in the corner of the room as a maid, no longer holding a rag in her trembling hands. She sat near the table now, her posture careful, yet her presence undeniable. She was the one carrying the conversation forward, her voice weaving between Arabic and English like a delicate bridge made of stone and silk. The CEO, once the towering master of his empire, now sat quieter than he had ever been in a meeting. His hands folded, his eyes not on his notes or his presentation slides but on Isla. He was watching her as if seeing a new world open in front of him. He could not understand the Arabic words themselves, but he could feel the energy in the room, the way the investors leaned toward her, the way their laughter rose when she shared a small proverb, the way their brows furrowed in respect when she spoke of dignity and trust. It was as if the maid had become the heart of the gathering, and he, for the first time, was only a guest at his own table. The investors, men known for their wealth and power, men who rarely softened in negotiations, were now speaking openly, almost as if they were at home among friends. They shared memories of their childhoods, of walking across burning sands to fetch water, of fathers who taught them that a man's word was worth more than gold. Isla listened with the patience of someone who understood hardship intimately, her own memories flashing quietly behind her. Steady eyes when she translated their stories into English for the CEO. She did not rush. She spoke slowly, carefully, ensuring that every detail carried the weight of the emotion behind it. And when she spoke of family, of sacrifice, of resilience, her voice trembled with sincerity because those words were not just theirs, they were hers as well. At one point, the elder investor leaned forward, his hands folded on the table, and in Arabic he asked Isla something no one had expected. "And what of you, daughter? What story do you carry in your heart? For you speak as one who knows struggle, not just language." The question silenced the room. Even the rival competitor stopped shifting in his seat, eyes narrowing in suspicion. Isla froze for a heartbeat, unsure whether it was her place to answer. But then she saw their faces, not stern with judgment but open with genuine curiosity, and she knew she could not hide, not anymore. She took a long breath and began to speak, her voice steady though her chest ached with old wounds. She spoke in Arabic first, then repeated in English for the CEO. She told them of the small village, where she was born, of the father who believed knowledge was a gift no one could steal, how he taught her Arabic under the shade of a broken tree, how he made her promise never to forget the power of words. Then she spoke of tragedy, of how her father died too young, how her mother's hands grew calloused providing for her, how she herself had carried dreams of teaching but was forced into work that paid little and respected less. She spoke of the humiliation of being invisible in great buildings, of cleaning up after people who never even asked her name, yet still holding on to the languages that lived in her heart. She confessed that she had whispered words to herself in empty rooms, afraid they might fade if she did not use them. As she spoke, the investors grew still, their eyes glistening not with pity but with recognition. They too knew what it meant to fight for survival, to honor family even in hardship, to carry dignity even when the world offered little respect. And the CEO sat frozen, shame-burning. In his chest, for months he had passed her in hallways, nodded coldly at her presence, treated her as part of the furniture. And yet here she was, a woman of courage and wisdom, whose story held more depth than his empire ever could. One of the younger investors wiped his eyes discreetly, then said in Arabic, "This woman has more honor than many who call themselves leaders." Isla translated his words quietly into English, but her gaze remained low, humility keeping her from basking in praise. The CEO, however, felt the sting of those words, for they were true. He had been a leader in name, but not always in honor, and the comparison struck him hard. The rival competitor, desperate not to lose control of the narrative, leaned forward and spat venom into the air. "Gentlemen, do not be fooled. She is only a maid. This company hides behind a servant because it cannot stand on its own." His words rang out harshly, and the silence that followed was suffocating. But Isla lifted her head slowly, her eyes, calm though her hands trembled. She spoke in Arabic with a firmness that surprised even herself. "A person's worth is not decided by uniform or title. It is decided by truth and by action. Today I speak because silence would have destroyed respect, and respect is the foundation of trust." Her voice filled the room. She then translated her own words into English for the CEO, her gaze steady as if daring the rival to challenge her again. The investors erupted in nods and murmurs of agreement. One even clapped his hands lightly against the table, saying in Arabic, "She is right. Trust is more precious than profit." And with that, the balance shifted entirely. The rival sat back, his face pale, defeated by a maid who had spoken with more authority than his wealth could ever purchase. The meeting that began as a disaster now glowed with possibility. The investors smiled, they laughed, they leaned closer to Isla as though she were not just a translator, but a partner in their dialogue. And when the elder investor finally turned back to the CEO, his voice carried a firmness that could not be ignored. In English, he said, "We will not sign anything today, not until we hear more from her tomorrow, for we trust her voice to guide us, not your polished slides." The CEO sat stunned, his mouth dry, his pride bleeding, yet his heart pounding with something strange, something close to gratitude. He realized in that moment that his empire had been saved not by power, not by money, not by his strategies, but by the courage of a woman who was never meant to speak at all. He looked at Isla, truly looked at her, and the sight of her straight posture, her steady eyes, her quiet dignity, froze him in place, for he knew with certainty that the future of his empire rested not in his own brilliance, but in her unseen strength. Respect earned, the boardroom was bathed in the midday sun, its glass walls glowing with streaks of gold that seemed to mirror the transformation unfolding inside. The CEO, a man who had built his identity on control and dominance, now sat in a unfamiliar position, humbled, silenced, and forced into reflection. His entire life he had believed that respect was commanded by power, by wealth, by the sharpness of strategy and the firmness of voice. Yet before his very eyes a maid had dismantled that illusion. Ila, who once carried rags and buckets unseen through the corridors of his empire, now sat at the table with a poise and dignity that not only saved his deal, but also challenged the very foundation of his pride. The investors had shifted fully toward her, their posture no longer guarded but open, their words no longer sharp but thoughtful. They directed their questions to her. They waited for her translations with patience. They nodded at her interpretations, as though she were not a servant but a scholar. Their eyes carried the kind of respect that men of their stature rarely gave to outsiders, and each time she spoke, the energy in the room deepened, weaving threads of trust that even millions of dollars could not have bought. The CEO watched helplessly, torn between resentment and admiration, for although her presence made him feel small, it also reminded him of something he had long forgotten, that leadership was not about commanding others, but about listening too. The truth, no matter where it came from. As the hours stretched on, Ila continued to prove herself. She did not simply echo words, she added layers of understanding. When one investor expressed concerns about technological ethics in their region, she did not reduce it to a sterile question. She explained gently that what he truly meant was the fear of losing cultural identity in a tide of foreign machines. When another spoke of expansion, she clarified that expansion was not only about profits but about relationships built slowly, like the planting of an orchard. Her words carried images that reached deeper than business language, and the CEO found himself leaning forward, listening intently not to figures or projections but to the lessons of humility that slipped into every sentence. At one point, the elder investor looked directly at the CEO and spoke in Arabic, his tone stern but not cruel. Ila translated with, "Honesty, he says that power without humility is like a tree without roots. It will fall when the storm comes." The words landed heavily in the CEO's chest. He felt them cut through the armor he had worn his entire life. He wanted to defend himself, to claim that he was not arrogant, but the truth was too obvious. He had been blind to the worth of those around him, blind to the human stories hidden behind uniforms and titles, blind to the very dignity of the woman who now sat before him shining brighter than his empire ever had. Something broke inside him then, something brittle and long protected. He looked at Ila, not as a tool, not as an accident of the moment, but as a person whose presence had revealed what billions of dollars never could. He cleared his throat and, for the first time in the entire meeting, his voice softened. He turned to the investors and spoke in English, his words halting but sincere. "Gentlemen, today I stand corrected. It seems my greatest strength was never in my preparation. It was in someone I never truly saw until now. Ila has not only given voice to this meeting, she has given heart to it. And from this moment forward, she is not my maid. She is my advisor." The room went still. Even Ila froze, her eyes widening. She had not expected public recognition, not from the man who had barely acknowledged her existence. Her hands trembled in her lap, but the investors smiled, nodding in approval. One of them leaned back and said in Arabic, "At last he speaks with humility." Ila translated faithfully, though her cheeks burned with quiet emotion. The rival, competitor clenched his fists, fury burning through him. He had hoped to see the CEO humiliated, broken, left to crumble. Instead, he was witnessing a rebirth. The CEO was no longer the untouchable figure he had once been, but in his humility, he seemed more human. And that humanity, paired with Ila's sincerity, made the investors lean toward him with newfound trust. The rivals carefully laid plans to snatch the deal dissolved like mist, and for the first time he realized that no amount of money or manipulation could compete with authenticity. The discussion moved again into the technical aspects of the partnership, but now it flowed like a calm river instead of a storm. The investors listened as Ila translated. They offered suggestions. They even laughed at moments when she shared small cultural anecdotes that lightened the mood. The CEO added his inputs, cautiously, not with arrogance but with care. Measuring his tone as if he were relearning how to speak, he watched the investors closely, noting how their expressions softened when Ila added layers of meaning, and for the first time in years he felt he was not in a battle, but in a conversation. By late afternoon, the outlines of the agreement had begun to take shape. It was not final, yet, but the direction was clear. The investors trusted not only the numbers but the sincerity behind them. They leaned on Isla's voice as though it were the compass guiding them across a desert, and when they finally stood to leave, their handshakes were firm, their eyes warm. One of them even placed a hand lightly on Isla's shoulder and said in Arabic, "We look forward to seeing you tomorrow, daughter. You are the light of this table." Isla's eyes filled with tears, but she translated the words calmly, her humility still stronger than her pride, as the investors exited with dignity. So remained seated, his body heavy with exhaustion but his mind alive with reflection. He looked across the table at Isla, who still sat quietly, her uniform plain, her hands folded, and yet she looked taller than any leader he had ever known. His throat tightened as he realized how blind he had been. He had spent his life searching for greatness in the wrong places, when it had been walking past him in the corridors, carrying a bucket, cleaning his empire without complaint. And he whispered inwardly, almost as if confessing to himself, "She saved me, she saved everything." A new future. The following morning the boardroom did not feel the same as the day before. The sun still spilled through the tall windows and the marble floors still gleamed, but there was something new in the air, something softer yet stronger, as if the very walls remembered what had happened within them. The CEO arrived early, a habit he had always kept, but his steps were slower than usual, his mind not racing with strategies or numbers. Instead, it was heavy with reflection. He had spent the night restless, turning in bed as scenes replayed in his mind. Isla standing in the corner with her rag and bucket. Isla whispering in Arabic when the meeting threatened to collapse. Isla telling her story with dignity. Isla commanding the respect of men who commanded billions, each memory cut through his pride like a blade, and by morning he realized he could not return to who he had been before. When Isla entered, dressed once, again in her plain uniform, her hands still smelling faintly of soap, he felt a pang of shame. The world might still see her as a maid, but in his eyes something had shifted. She was no longer invisible. She was no longer just staff. She was the woman who had saved his empire, and more than that, she had reminded him of the value of humanity itself. He wanted to say something to her. Words of thanks, words of apology, but when he opened his mouth, the weight of years of arrogance pressed down and silenced him. All he managed was a nod, but this time it was not the cold nod of a man dismissing a servant. It was the quiet nod of a man bowing, even if only slightly, to someone greater than himself. When the Arab investors entered, their presence filled the room with gravitas, but unlike the day before, they did not carry impatience in their eyes. They carried warmth. They greeted Isla first, addressing her in Arabic as daughter, and asking if she had rested well. Their voices gentle and their smiles genuine, she answered humbly. Her gaze lowered, yet her tone calm. She translated their greetings for the CEO, but he understood even without the words the respect they held for her was clear. The negotiations began again, but this time the flow was entirely different. There was no storm of suspicion, no wall of misunderstanding. Instead, it was a steady rhythm of questions and answers, of clarifications and agreements. The investors trusted the CEO more now, not because of his numbers or his empire, but because he had shown humility in recognizing Isla, and they trusted Isla above all. They knew that as long as her voice guided the table, there would be honesty, there would be no tricks, and that trust was priceless. Isla worked tirelessly once again, her voice smooth and confident, carrying meaning across languages like a bridge that could not break. But today something inside her was different too. Yesterday she had stepped forward out of necessity. Today she spoke with a sense of belonging, as though she had finally accepted that her place was not in the shadows but at the center. She carried herself with quiet pride. Not arrogance, but the pride of someone who had survived hardship and still held on to her dignity. The rival competitor returned, his face pale with anger. He tried once more to disrupt the process, interrupting with comments about professionalism and claiming that the CEO was weak to lean on a maid, but the investors silenced him with sharp glares. One of them even said in Arabic, "Weakness is in arrogance, strength is in humility." Isla translated those words into English, and when the CEO heard them, he lowered his eyes, feeling both the sting and the truth. The rival had no more weapons left, and by midday he stormed out of the room, defeated by a woman he had mocked, the door closing behind him like the final note of a failed song. The final hours of negotiation were steady and calm. Details were ironed out, figures agreed upon, timelines drafted. But what mattered most was not the signatures on paper but the bond that had been forged. When the elder investor finally stood and extended his hand to the CEO, his voice was steady. As he said in English, "We trust you, but we trust her more. Do not waste what she has given you." The CEO shook his hand, humbled to his core, and then he turned to Isla, his voice breaking slightly as he said, "This partnership belongs to you as much as to me." She looked down, tears threatening her eyes, but she translated his words for the room with composure, her humility still shining even as history was being made. When the investors left, promising to finalize contracts within the week, the CEO remained in the room with Isla, the silence heavy but different from before, not sharp, not suffocating, but thick with unspoken gratitude. He finally found the courage to speak, his voice softer than it had ever been. "I owe you more than thanks, Isla. You saved me when I was blind. You saved my company when it was collapsing. You reminded me of what matters. From this day forward, you are not my maid. You are my cultural advisor, my partner in every negotiation that requires wisdom. If you accept, you will have an office, a salary worthy of your skill, and above all, the respect that should have been yours long ago." Ayla's breath caught. She felt the ground beneath her shift. Never had she dreamed of such words. Yet she remained calm, her eyes filling but her voice steady. "Sir, I only did what was right. I spoke because silence would have cost you dignity. But if my voice can bring honor to the table, then I accept." The CEO nodded, and for the first time in his life, he felt not pride, but humility. He felt that greatness was not in power, but in recognizing the strength of others. The story of what happened spread quickly beyond the glass walls of the skyscraper. Whispers carried through corridors, through newsrooms, through the markets. People spoke not only of the $300 million deal that had been secured, but of the maid who saved it. Headlines spoke of humility and hidden strength. Commentators praised the courage of a woman who stepped forward when no one else could, and in households across the world, her story became a lesson, a reminder that greatness is not always found in the powerful but often in those overlooked. For Isla, life changed. But she did not lose herself. She walked the same halls she once cleaned, but now with her head high. Not with arrogance, but with dignity. She greeted staff by name, offering kindness to those still unseen. She carried her new role with grace, never forgetting the rag in her hand that day when everything began. And for the CEO, the change was even deeper. He learned to listen, to see, to value the people who had once been invisible. His empire grew stronger, not because of money, but because of the respect he now built within it. And every time he walked into a meeting with Isla by his side, he carried the silent reminder that he had been saved not by wealth, but by courage born from humility. And so the tale ended not with the signing of papers or the celebration of profit, but with a truth larger than any deal. That power without respect is hollow. That greatness without humility is fragile. And that sometimes the voice that saves an empire is the one you never thought to hear.